It was Christmas Eve, and the sky was heavy with snow as Sophie drove through the quiet streets of her hometown. The town hadn't changed much since she left years ago. Narrow streets, lined with old houses, the smell of pine and firewood drifting in the air, and the familiar creak of the wooden bridge near the town square. But as she made her way toward the house she once called home, everything felt different. The warmth of the season seemed distant, replaced by a chill that went deeper than the winter air. Sophie hadn't wanted to return, but something pulled her back. Maybe it was the quiet emptiness of her city apartment or the pressure of the holidays, but she found herself driving up the same long driveway that led to her childhood home, where so many memories had been made and broken. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she parked in front of the house, its outline barely visible through the falling snow. She sat for a moment, staring at the house. The familiar, comforting sight of the old porch swing now seemed out of place, as if the house itself had forgotten her. It was strange to think that she had once spent hours here, laughing and playing, feeling safe and loved. But those days felt like a distant dream, lost to time and unresolved pain. Sophie stepped out of the car and pulled her coat tighter around her body. The cold was biting, but it was nothing compared to the coldness she felt inside. She walked up to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest, and knocked gently. She didn't know what to expect. Maybe an enthusiastic greeting from her mother, or perhaps a stiff and distant hello. Either way, she knew this visit wouldn't be easy. The door creaked open, and there stood her mother, looking almost the same as Sophie remembered, though her face seemed more tired, the lines around her eyes deeper. Her mother didn't smile. Instead, there was a brief pause before she spoke. "You're here," her mother said flatly, stepping aside to let Sophie in. Sophie entered the house, and the familiar scent of pine and cinnamon filled her nose. But something was off. The warmth that usually filled the house during Christmas was absent, replaced by a tense silence. The Christmas tree in the corner was hastily decorated, its lights blinking erratically. The ornaments hung unevenly as if no one had put much thought into it. It looked as though the decorations were done in a rush, as if there was no joy in it, no real celebration. Sophie dropped her bag by the door and took off her coat. Her mother stood by the tree, not offering any help or warmth, her eyes distant. Sophie could feel the unspoken distance between them, a chasm that had been growing for years. "How have you been?" her mother asked, breaking the silence. Sophie forced a smile, though it felt unnatural on her lips. "I've been fine, busy with work. You know how it is." She glanced around the room, taking in the details, how the furniture looked unchanged, but everything felt smaller, older. The pictures on the walls, once full of laughter and family vacations, now seemed faded, like memories that were slowly being erased. The silence stretched again, and Sophie couldn't help but remember their last conversation before she left for good. The argument that had left her with a bitter taste in her mouth. The words that had been said, things they both regretted but couldn't take back. Her mother had always been distant, but that night was different. The hurt was deeper, the anger more cutting. Sophie had left, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, but she hadn't been able to forgive her mother, and her mother had never apologized. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to push the old wounds to the back of her mind. "Is Dad coming?" she asked, changing the subject. Her mother shook her head. "No, he's busy with work," she said, her voice cool and emotionless. It was clear that her father's absence was a regular occurrence, a part of the routine they had both grown accustomed to. Sophie nodded, though she didn't know what to say. She could feel the ache in her chest growing, the weight of everything unspoken between them. It was as if the years of silence had built a wall that was impossible to tear down. Her mother moved towards the kitchen without another word, leaving Sophie standing by the tree, feeling more alone than ever. She stared at the tree's uneven branches, the garish tinsel and broken ornaments. The festive decorations felt more like an afterthought, a forced attempt at normalcy in a home that had long since lost its warmth. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood back. She thought of her childhood, Christmas mornings filled with laughter, the smell of her mother's cooking filling the air, and the sound of her father's deep voice as he read the Christmas story aloud. But all of those moments had been overshadowed by the fights, the hurtful words, and the deep sense of abandonment she had always felt from her mother. When she opened her eyes again, her mother was standing in the doorway, watching her. There was something unreadable in her expression, a mix of longing and regret that Sophie couldn't quite place. "Do you want something to eat?" her mother asked softly, breaking the silence. Sophie nodded, though her stomach felt heavy. The thought of sitting down to a meal with her mother felt strange, as if they were two strangers trying to reconnect. But she had nowhere else to go, and she wasn't sure if she even wanted to leave. So she followed her mother into the kitchen, the silence between them still thick, but somehow less suffocating. As they sat down to a quiet, awkward meal, Sophie couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly heal the rift between them, or if the past would always hang over them like an unshakable shadow. But for now, all she could do was sit and wait, hoping that something, anything would shift, that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas could be the start of something new. The snow continued to fall in thick, quiet flakes, covering everything in a soft, white blanket. Sophie had just stepped out of the small local cafe, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't mind it. She felt disconnected from everything, her mother, the house, the town she once knew. It was as if everything had become a blur, the weight of past memories pressing down on her chest. She was lost in her thoughts when a voice broke through the silence. "Sophie?" She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. She turned around slowly, her heart skipping a beat. Standing there in front of the cafe's frosted window was Jason, her ex-boyfriend, the one person she had never expected to see again. He looked different, older, perhaps a little more worn, but still unmistakably him. The same warm brown eyes, the same easy smile that used to make her feel like everything was going to be okay. "Sophie," he repeated, stepping closer. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. "I can't believe it's really you." Sophie stood there, stunned, her body frozen as the past flooded back. The long nights they spent talking, the way he used to look at her with such intensity, the love they had shared. It hadn't been an easy relationship. There had been arguments, misunderstandings, and eventually an unresolved ending. But they had been close, so close that the memory of him had never really left her. She had tried to move on, tried to forget, but seeing him now, it felt like no time had passed at all. "Jason," her voice came out soft, almost hesitant. She wasn't sure what to say. "What are you doing here?" He gave a small laugh, scratching the back of his head awkwardly. "I moved back here a few months ago, got a job with the town's development board." He glanced around the street, the familiar setting of their hometown making him appear almost nostalgic. "And you? I didn't expect to see you here, especially not during Christmas." Sophie's gaze dropped to the ground, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'm just visiting. For a few days. Family stuff. Her words felt hollow, as if the weight of her return to the town was more about the past than the present. There was an awkward silence between them, the kind that lingered longer than it should have. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had formed between them all those years ago. Jason, sensing her discomfort, took a step closer. "Do you want to walk for a bit?" he asked. "It's been a long time, and I don't think we ever got to really talk after everything." Sophie hesitated, her heart a little heavier at the mention of everything. She knew what he meant, what they never fully talked about, the last argument they had, the words that were left unsaid, the reasons they had broken up, the things they had both regretted. But standing there in the cold, facing him again, all those old emotions stirred to the surface. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face them, but at the same time, a part of her longed for that connection again. "Okay," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's walk." They moved through the quiet streets together, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The town seemed almost deserted, as though everyone else had already retreated inside to their families, leaving only Sophie and Jason to wander under the streetlights, surrounded by the stillness of the night. As they walked, the old familiarity began to settle between them. It was strange how easily they fell into step with each other, like they hadn't been apart for years. They passed by the old park where they had spent countless afternoons, the bench where they had kissed for the first time, and the corner shop where they used to pick up coffee on lazy mornings. Everything felt the same, yet completely different. "I never thought I'd see you again," Jason said after a few minutes of silence, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "I mean, I knew you were living in the city, but I never expected this." Sophie looked at him, her breath coming in small clouds. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice quiet. I thought it was better if we just moved on. Too much happened, too much we couldn't fix." Jason nodded, his expression softening. "I get that. I know I made mistakes. I should have listened more, been more patient. But I also know that when things ended, I never stopped thinking about you, about us." His words hung in the air, and Sophie felt a pang in her chest. She had never truly let go of him either, not completely. The pain of their breakup, the way they had parted without closure, had stayed with her, buried deep inside. They stopped at the edge of the park, where the trees were dusted with snow and the swing set creaked in the wind. Jason turned to face her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand what she was feeling. Sophie felt her heart race, her mind spinning. She could feel the connection between them, still there, still raw, like an open wound that neither had been able to heal. I shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I was expecting, but this doesn't feel like just old memories. It feels like something else, like we never really finished what we started." Jason stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed. The same pull, the same undeniable tension. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and Sophie felt a spark of warmth. "I never wanted to leave things unfinished," Jason murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes you need distance to see things clearly." The words hung in the air, and Sophie could feel herself drawn to him, the feelings she had buried for so long threatening to rise to the surface. She wasn't sure if she was ready to confront them, but being with him again made her question everything: the past, the choices she had made, and what could have been if they hadn't let go. The night was quiet, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the trees, as they stood there, caught between the past and the present. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, but in that moment, both of them knew that something had changed between them, something deep and unspoken. And maybe, just maybe, it was a second chance, if they were both brave enough to take it. The days leading up to Christmas were cold, but it wasn't the winter chill that made Sophie feel uneasy. It was the weight of the silence that hung over the house, a silence that deepened with every passing hour. Her mother had remained distant, colder than the snowy nights outside, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Despite their earlier attempt at reconciliation, the air between them remained thick, filled with unsaid words and unresolved tensions. Christmas Eve finally arrived, and with it, the traditional family gathering. The house was filled with the sounds of distant laughter and the clinking of glasses, but it all felt disconnected, like a performance put on for appearances. Sophie stood in the doorway of the living room, her eyes scanning the crowd of familiar faces. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all were gathered around the fireplace, but there was no warmth in their greetings, no true joy. The years of separation, the long stretches of unspoken words, had turned their once lively gatherings into stiff rituals. Her mother, wearing a forced smile, greeted everyone as they arrived, her eyes never meeting Sophie's for more than a fleeting moment. Sophie felt like an outsider in her own home, an awkward guest at a party she had never wanted to attend. As she moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with family members she hadn't seen in years, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was silently acknowledging the elephant in the room: her return, her broken relationship with her mother, the unresolved past that no one dared to address. "How's life in the city, Sophie?" her Aunt Clara asked, her voice warm but too sharp with curiosity. "I bet it's busy, huh?" Sophie forced a smile, trying to mask the unease she felt. "It's good, Aunt Clara. Busy but good. You know how it is." But her words felt hollow. She wasn't really talking about her life in the city. She was talking about the life she had escaped from, the life where her relationship with her mother had been a series of arguments and misunderstandings, a constant emotional distance that no one seemed able to bridge. And now, standing here in the cold warmth of the family's holiday gathering, it was clear that nothing had changed. She caught her mother's eye across the room. For a moment, it seemed like a silent invitation, a plea for some sort of connection. Sophie's heart skipped, but she quickly looked away. There was too much hurt between them, too many things left unsaid. Yet, the pull was undeniable. She had spent years running from this, from her mother's coldness, and yet here she was, back in the same house, back in the same role, the daughter who never quite fit in. Dinner was served in the dining room, a large spread of turkey, mashed potatoes, and all the usual holiday trimmings. Everyone gathered around the table, but the conversation was strained, forced. The clinking of fork against plates was the loudest sound in the room. Sophie sat between her mother and her cousin Hannah, trying to focus on the food, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the past. As the meal went on, Sophie found herself growing restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to talk to her mother, to finally confront the distance that had come between them. But every time she opened her mouth, the words felt trapped in her throat, tangled with too many years of resentment and confusion. Finally, after dessert was served and the others had moved to the living room, Sophie couldn't wait any longer. She stood up, excused herself from the table, and made her way to the back of the house where her mother was cleaning up the dishes. The house, now quiet, seemed to hold its breath. "Sophie, what are you doing?" Her mother's voice broke the silence as Sophie stood in the kitchen doorway. Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "I want to talk," she said, her voice low, almost uncertain. Her mother didn't answer right away. She continued wiping down the counter, her back turned to Sophie as if avoiding the conversation. "There's nothing to talk about," she finally said, her tone sharp but tired. Sophie's frustration flared. "That's not true. We've never talked about anything, Mom. Not really. And I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Her mother stopped, her hand frozen on the dish towel. She turned slowly to face Sophie, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, with a sigh, her mother dropped the towel and gestured for Sophie to sit down at the kitchen table. "Fine," she said quietly. "Talk. But I don't think it's going to change anything." Sophie sat down, her mind racing. She had thought about this conversation for years, but now that it was happening, the words felt like they were coming from someone else. "I don't understand you, Mom," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand why we can never talk, why you've always kept me at arm's length. You never showed me love the way I needed it. And I'm so tired of carrying this weight on my own." Her mother's face darkened, but Sophie pressed on. "I know I wasn't perfect. I know I made mistakes, but I don't understand why you never tried to fix things, why you always pushed me away." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Her mother stood up abruptly, her eyes avoiding Sophie's. "You think I didn't try?" she snapped. "You think I didn't feel the same way? But sometimes people just get tired of trying. And maybe it's better that way." Sophie's heart sank. She had never heard her mother speak like this, so raw, so vulnerable. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Her mother's voice lowered, barely a whisper. "There are things you don't know, Sophie. Things I've kept from you. Things I should have told you long ago." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Her mother looked at her for a long moment, the weight of years of secrets hanging in the air. "Your father, he wasn't who you thought he was, and neither was I. We both made choices, Sophie, choices that you will never fully understand, but maybe you don't need to. Maybe it's better if you don't." The words hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She had always known there were things her mother wasn't saying, but this was something else, something deeper. Her world, already fragile, began to crumble around her as she realized that the foundation of her family, the very thing she had clung to for so long, was built on lies and secrets. "Mom, what do you mean?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. But her mother only shook her head. "I can't tell you everything, Sophie. Some things are better left in the past." Sophie's mind reeled, her heart a storm of confusion and hurt. She had come here hoping to find answers, hoping to make sense of the years of silence. But instead, she found only more questions, more uncertainty. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. As she sat there, staring at her mother, the cracks in their family deepened. The lies, the secrets, the things that had never been said. They were now impossible to ignore, and Sophie realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The family she had once known was a mirage, and the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. The night was thick with snow, a soft, constant fall that seemed to muffle the world around them. Sophie and Jason had walked for hours, their footsteps crunching in the silence of the empty streets. The town had long since retreated into its Christmas slumber, but for them the night felt alive, charged with something neither of them could ignore. They found themselves at the edge of the woods, near an old cabin that had been abandoned for years. It was a place they used to visit together when they were young, hidden, quiet, far from prying eyes. It was the perfect place to escape, to speak without the weight of their family's expectations, without the tension that clung to every word they had spoken in recent years. Jason pushed open the creaky door and they stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling the air. The small cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. Sophie shivered as she stepped further into the room, the cold air biting at her skin. Jason closed the door behind them, his movements deliberate, but it was clear from the way he lingered, the way he looked at her, that something was about to change between them. Sophie. He said her name softly, almost like a question. His voice was deep, laced with something Sophie couldn't quite place. Desire, confusion, or perhaps both. She turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes were dark, searching hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The tension between them had become tangible, a physical thing, and Sophie could feel it pulling her closer to him, even though she knew it was dangerous. "I don't know what I'm doing," Jason confessed, his voice rough. "I don't know what we're doing, but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Sophie felt a wave of heat rush through her, mixed with a deep ache that had been there ever since their last goodbye. She had never really let go of him, not completely. There had always been a part of her that longed for this, the closeness, the passion, the intimacy they had once shared. But the pain, the unresolved hurt was still there too, and it tangled with her desire, making it difficult to know what she truly wanted. "I don't know either," she whispered, taking a step closer to him. "But I feel it too. I feel everything. And I don't know if it's right. But I can't walk away from this. Not again." Jason reached for her, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down her spine, and for a moment the past melted away, leaving only the present, the two of them, standing on the edge of something they couldn't control. "Sophie, I never stopped wanting you," he said, his voice low and filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "I never stopped loving you." Sophie closed her eyes, the words hitting her like a wave. She had heard them before, years ago, but now, in this moment, they felt different. They felt like the truth, raw, unfiltered. But she wasn't sure if the truth was enough to erase the distance between them, to undo all the years of pain, of mistakes. "I've never stopped loving you either," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But we can't just pick up where we left off. It's not that simple, Jason." His hands slid down her arms, pulling her closer, the heat between them undeniable. "I don't want it to be simple," he murmured, his lips brushing against her ear. "I just want you." The words were a spark, igniting something deep within her. Sophie closed her eyes, surrendering to the pull, the yearning that had been building between them since their reunion. She could feel her heart racing, her body responding to him in ways she hadn't expected. But even as the desire washed over her, a part of her knew this couldn't last, not like this. "Jason." Her voice was barely a whisper as she pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. "What are we doing? What happens after this?" He paused, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were or if we even should. But I can't pretend like we don't have something between us, something real." Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. She could feel her heart in her chest, beating wildly, out of control, the weight of their past, Their broken relationship pressed against her, but so did the warmth of their connection. She wanted him, wanted this closeness, this intimacy that felt so familiar, so right. But at the same time, she knew it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "We can't undo everything, Jason," she said softly, stepping back from him. "We can't just pretend like none of it happened." His eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and longing. "I know," he said, his voice tight, "but I also know that I can't walk away from you again. Not like this." Sophie took a deep breath, her mind racing. She wanted him. God, she wanted him. But she also wanted something more, something that was beyond desire, beyond the pain and the broken pieces of their past. And she knew, deep down, that this, whatever this was, wasn't the answer. Not for her, not for them. "Jason, I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't keep going around in circles. I need to figure out who I am without you, without this." Jason stared at her, his expression torn. He stepped back, his face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. "So, what are you saying? That you want to walk away from everything we've ever had?" Sophie closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm saying I need to stop pretending that this thing between us, is the answer. I need to figure out who I am, what I really want." The silence between them stretched, filled with the weight of everything they had shared and everything they had lost. Jason ran a hand through his hair, his expression hardening, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I get it," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I do, but it doesn't make it any easier." Sophie nodded, her heart heavy in her chest. She could feel the pull, the desire still burning between them. But she knew that this, whatever this was, wasn't enough. Not anymore. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I need to find my own way." Jason didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his face unreadable, before he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Sophie stayed in the cold, silent cabin, her body trembling from more than just the chill of the night air. She had made the right choice, she told herself. But as the door closed softly behind him, the emptiness inside her grew, and she realized that sometimes, knowing the truth wasn't enough to stop the ache of longing that lingered. The final hours of Christmas Eve were approaching, and the quiet snowstorm outside seemed to mirror Sophie's inner turmoil. The house was empty now, the party over, and the distant laughter of her family had faded into the stillness of the night. Sophie sat by the window, watching the snow fall in thick, soft layers. She felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The weight of everything, the past, the pain, the confusion, was still there, but it no longer held the same power over her. Earlier that evening, after Jason had left the cabin, Sophie had made a decision. She needed to face the reality of her life, the reality of her relationship with her mother, with herself. She couldn't keep running from the truth any longer. The unresolved anger, the buried pain. It was time to let go. Her mother had retreated to her room after the family had left, but Sophie knew it was now or never. She needed to speak with her, to clear the air once and for all. There was no more avoiding the difficult conversations. There was no more pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Sophie walked down the narrow hallway toward her mother's room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Her heart raced as she knocked softly on the door. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was tentative but firm. After a long pause, the door creaked open and her mother stood there, still wearing the same expression of guarded distance Sophie had seen all evening. but there was something else in her eyes. A flicker of something like vulnerability, maybe even hope. "Can we talk?" Sophie asked, her voice quieter now, but the words felt like the beginning of something important. Her mother nodded, stepping aside to let Sophie in. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the bedside table. There was a warmth in the room, but it was the kind of warmth that felt almost artificial, like it was trying to cover up a long-standing coldness. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Her mother sat across from her, her posture stiff, but Sophie could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know how to start," Sophie said, her voice soft but steady. I guess I just need to say everything I've been holding in." Her mother didn't say anything at first, just nodded slightly, as if waiting for Sophie to continue. "I don't understand why you pushed me away for so long," Sophie said, her voice trembling just a little. "Why you kept everything so distant. I thought it was because of me, that maybe I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't what you wanted." Her mother's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Sophie saw something like pain flash across her face. "No, Sophie," she said, her voice low. "It wasn't you. It was never you." Sophie blinked, surprised. "Then why? Why did we drift so far apart?" Her mother looked away for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then, slowly she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept things from you, if I kept my distance, I could keep you safe from the mistakes I made, from the things you didn't need to know." Sophie frowned, confused. "Mistakes? What do you mean?" Her mother sighed deeply, rubbing her forehead, as if the weight of the years was too much to bear. "Your father and I, we weren't happy. We weren't the people you thought we were. And I didn't want you to see that. I didn't want you to carry that burden." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always known there were secrets, things that her mother had kept hidden, but this felt like something deeper. "What are you saying, Mom?" Her mother met her eyes now, her gaze steady, but tinged with regret. "I'm saying I made a lot of choices that I shouldn't have, and I kept you out of the truth because I thought I was doing what was best for you. But in doing that, I hurt you, I pushed you away, and I never gave you the chance to understand why." Sophie felt the flood of emotions rising in her chest. The anger, the sadness, the relief, the things she had blamed herself for, the things she had never fully understood, were now being revealed, one piece at a time. She realized that her mother had been carrying a burden too, one that had shaped her own life, her own choices. "I wish you had told me," Sophie said softly, her voice breaking. "I wish I had known. Maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone." Her mother reached across the space between them, her hand trembling as she touched Sophie's. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. I thought I was protecting you, but I only hurt you more, and I regret that every day." Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years, of the silence, the misunderstandings, the unspoken words, begin to lift, just a little. She had always felt like something was missing, like there was a gap between her and her mother that nothing could bridge. But now, sitting in front of her, Sophie realized that it was never about being perfect or making everything right. It was about understanding, about seeing each other not just as mother and daughter, but as two flawed, imperfect people trying to make sense of their lives. "I don't know if I can forget everything," Sophie said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I can try to forgive. We can try to move forward, together." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, she smiled. A real smile, full of relief and sorrow and hope. "Thank you, Sophie. That's all I can ask for, just a chance to start over." Sophie nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a beginning, a new beginning, for both of them. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and steady, as Sophie walked back to her room later that night. She had said what needed to be said, and in that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her relationship with her mother wasn't fixed, not yet, but they had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't easy, but it was real. As Sophie sat by the window, staring out at the winter night, her thoughts turned to Jason. She still cared for him, that much was certain, but she knew their paths had diverged. They had reached a moment of closure, of understanding, and though they couldn't be together, they had both grown, and that, Sophie realized, was enough. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt ready to face it. She was standing on the edge of something new, something unknown, but there was no fear in her heart, only the quiet promise of a fresh start, of forgiveness and of hope. Sophie stepped outside into the crisp air, the snowflakes swirling around her as she walked alone into the night. She looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. There was something beautiful about this moment, something full of possibility. And as she stood there, her breath visible in the cold air, Sophie realized that she wasn't just letting go of the past. She was stepping into the future with an open heart and a renewed sense of self. The snow fell around her, soft and endless, as she looked toward the horizon, ready to begin again.